By now you've probably heard people throw out the words modern, postmodern, and other variations of modern.
As modernity goes up in a society, the suicide rate goes up.
Modern civilization is heading for collapse within a matter of decades.
Postmodernists completely reject the structure of Western civilization.
But what do these terms mean? Are they good? Are they bad? And most importantly, do any of them apply to us? Are we modern? The word modern has a couple of connotations. The first is the most common and one most people are familiar with. Living in a modern world or era simply means that we live today in the world. In most cases, it doesn't reference any way of thinking, but it does have some baggage. Since you're the person that lives in the modern era, you may be expected to look, think, or behave in a certain way. You live in the modern world, so you should act like it. This underlying meaning, this baggage, is attributed to a second, more nuanced definition of modern. Modernity is a certain time period, but it's also associated with certain values. Modernism attempts to go beyond the limits of mundane, materialistic values to a more refined, elegant way of thinking, behaving, learning, and expressing oneself. Modern art, modern thinking, ideas of self-awareness and progress, these are all considered a part of modernism. They're what make us better, and who wouldn't want to improve? Let's be modern, right? This framework rose out of the 18th century Enlightenment era, where science and philosophy sparked several lines of thinking, including the concept of the universal aesthetic with Kant and Hegel, which says that we can agree to universal standards of beauty. We also have René Descartes and his mind-body dualism. The Enlightenment is also associated with Adam Smith in economics, mathematician Sir Isaac Newton, philosophers John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, Robert Boyle, who's considered to be the first chemist, and many other thinkers who, like Boyle, we credit to this day for creating or advancing academic fields that we see in modern universities. And in a lot of ways, the spirit of modernity is alive in these different disciplines. But modernism is also the faith that we collectively developed in these disciplines to do exactly what we believe they could. So from creating objectively wonderful art to solving some of the world's biggest problems. So psychologists advance theories about the mind, behavior, and learning. And economists should hopefully advance our understanding of both local and global economies. And this modern logic was also applied to the post-World War II reconstruction of Europe, when countries like Germany, France, and the UK were in shambles. Many world organizations like the World Bank arose during this time in order to help rebuild Europe. And then they directed their attention to try to develop the rest of the underdeveloped world. This belief in a uniform, linear development is exactly what being modern is all about. But along with modernity, we also have at least three other categories of modern. The first one is pre-modernism. These supposed pre-moderns are usually painted as non-Western people whose cultures have historically and anthropologically been painted as uncivilized and completely different from our own. Their perceptions of time are said to be different, which in a lot of ways means that they're just disorganized or maybe not as efficient or as good as ours. Instead of having separate, purified disciplines like we do, the pre-moderns just mix everything together. There's no separation of church and state, no separation of politics and science. They're painted as living in pristine nature, and their society is less sophisticated than our own. On the other hand, we have anti-moderns, who are moderns through and through, except they struggle against the unending progress of modernity. Anti-moderns want to turn back the clock, to return to a better past. The phrase, "Make America Great Again," implies that America was once great, isn't anymore, and something that we need to return to. But this anti-modernism does accept the progress narrative that modernism constructs. And it imagines the past before progress occurred as being better, even though the past most likely wasn't what they imagined it was. Philosopher Bruno Latour defines modernity as how we think about progress, especially the different categories that we use to create that progress. So for example, in the United States, we say that it's imperative that we separate science, politics, and religion from one another. So we have this idea of a separation between church and state, and we also believe that science needs to not be tainted by politics. Science is supposed to be all about truth and objectivity, right? There certainly are merits to wanting to have an objective science, but what's relevant here is that by separating science, politics, religion, and everything else, we actually end up creating a series of paradoxes that logically result in postmodern thought. A postmodernity became necessary because modernism has some fundamental flaws. Though modernism is not without benefits, modernist thinkers have argued for a series of propositions that are both useful and fundamentally flawed in some very key ways. Latour uses Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan and Robert Boyle's vacuum pump as examples of this conflict. So in the first corner, some scientists like Boyle might say that nature is infinitely powerful. Nature is seen as larger than us, and we can study it through rigorous empirical data collection and analysis. We can observe nature and construct a series of facts, hypotheses, and theories based on these observations. We can't change these facts no matter how much we would like to. For instance, are we severely limited by what our genes enable us to do? If we're genetically predisposed to cancer or some other debilitating disease like ALS, which it does seem like some people are, then we're at nature's mercy. By the same token, we might argue that society is completely our construction. And of course it is, because nature is the real objective world that we can observe, yet it controls us. Society is our answer to a transcendent nature. But in the other corner, we have others like Hobbes, who might argue that society is beyond any one of us. Systems are in place for the greater good. We can't do anything about society's laws, nor should we. We're also completely free from nature, and we have unlimited possibilities ahead of us. Think about it. We've removed ourselves from the food chain. We've created a world that works for us. It's okay that we get rid of any commitment to other ideological systems like religion, because at the end of the day, even science is at the mercy of this delicate system that, without society, there would be no science. After all, nature is artificially created in a laboratory. We don't study nature itself, and we never have. Now, these two perspectives are presented in their extreme, but with them, we're left with a certain number of facts. First is that we can't do anything about nature's laws, yet we're completely free from them, with limitless possibilities. And second, we are individuals, free to live in a free society, yet we're limited by the requirement that we do obey its laws. The arguments are subtle, but also pretty profound here. They contradict each other, but they also really don't. Modernism paints us as being outside of nature, yet we erected a science that shows how we're at its mercy. Similarly, modernism persists to tell us that the only thing separating us from the animals are our laws. Yet we're also individuals free to do as we please. The root problem here isn't that there are these different perspectives that contradict one another. It's that we only ever represent one of them at any given time. Modernity really just means taking a stance based on a purified yet specialized perspective. And these contradictions are precisely what led to the postmodern era. So postmodernism rejects much of what modernism proposes. It recognizes these contradictions, but in its most extreme form, postmodernism rejects modernism by arguing that science is, by definition, tainted by politics, leaving us to question, can good, objective science really exist? While postmodernism questions modernism, in many ways, just like the anti-moderns, according to Latour, postmoderns actually believe even more in the modern separation of things than the moderns do. So postmodernism itself can be a bit of a paradox. But what exactly are these contradictions that led to these different kinds of thinking? The first is that nature and society are separate. This is a prospect that we can draw a line between what we humans have constructed and what nature naturally created. And we can be satisfied with that separation. So a nature versus culture dichotomy is created. The second is that the pre-moderns are one with nature, and we inhabit this sophisticated culture. So this is linked with the first one in that we moderns are separate and different from pre-moderns, who we imagine as being more one with nature than we are. Now this is argued to be self-evident because, look, we've transformed our surroundings, rendering them unidentifiable compared to the original forms they took in nature. The fact that we can draw a line between us and nature at all must mean that we can separate ourselves from it. Then, after this purification process, we can then study it. And third, modernity obliterates God by separating God from everything else. Nietzsche elaborated on this idea as well, arguing that the Enlightenment killed God. In modernism, God becomes an impotent yet ultimate judge. We need to remove God from logic, science, and society, while also allowing God to do the work that needs to be done on our spirits and our spirits alone. So God is bracketed off, just like nature and society. Fourth is the notion that we can subject everything to objective, empirical, scientific inquiry and scrutiny. Because everything has been separated and purified, modernity means being able to observe, measure, and come up with universal models that can help us explain the world around us. The laws of nature and grand narratives about society and culture are able to be constructed because of our modern way of thinking and operationalizing the world. And the last modern principle is that time is linear. The more we move forward in time, the more things improve, change, and become completely different from what came before. This modern logic says that in the past, people were more ignorant and less aware than they are now. Technology has unquestionably improved, and the world has gotten better, our problems more complex, and our answers to those problems even more complex as well. This logic is what allows anti-moderns to want to turn back the clock. They agree that time is linear, but they disagree that things are better now. They don't question the model, they just question its interpretation. These 5 concepts are pretty recognizable, and the fact that they don't always ring true doesn't make them inherently wrong. But we have to understand that our society has been built up with an understanding that the world is made up of separate spheres. We have work lives, personal lives, and personal time. We have different groups of friends. We might believe in God and read the Bible, but not necessarily want that to influence our politics or our science. These things aren't mutually exclusive, but they are separate from one another. But how true are these 5 propositions? So is time really that linear? There are several reasons to believe that it's not that simple. The idea that pre-modern peoples couldn't have been as advanced as us has led to ancient aliens theories. It's hard to believe that pyramids could have been built using methods that we logically imagine others thousands of years ago couldn't possibly have had. But considering there have been hostile regime changes, book burnings, and other events resulting in loss of knowledge throughout history, we can't really know for sure. Our depictions of Neanderthals as brutish and stupid is also not validated by any scientific findings. That's more of a social construction that science is actually refuting. So time becomes more of what Latour calls a polytemporal spiral. Issues resurface, new answers are usually adapted from old ones, and things that happened in the past seem to come back again. So issues like immigration, race, war, and many other things. So history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. But more importantly, is it desirable to want to disconnect our society from nature, from God, and from science? The answer is complex and not one that has ever been satisfyingly concluded. The conflicts between postmodernists and scientific realists during the science wars of the 1990s thrust a lot of these issues into the public sphere, but they never did anything with them. They asked, can science be truly objective? There's a lot that can be gained by engaging in this issue, and more importantly, if used correctly. Reflecting on this question can result in better science, not lack of science. There is a benefit in disconnecting science from other things. The best thing that we can do to conduct a good, faithful study is to remove personal bias and other extraneous elements from the context. We call this being objective. But these debates put forth by postmodernists in the social sciences resulted in what we call reflexivity, which is the act of taking into account the researcher in the research context. The meaning of this can vary. It can mean acknowledging your personal bias, which could make doing research difficult. So imagine believing that the world was flat while trying to test whether it was spherical. Ideally, we should be objective, but it'd still be pretty important to be honest about where you stand on a given issue, even if it's only with yourself and not explicitly to anybody else. Reflexivity could also mean more of an observer effect. So like whether a physical observation or presence can bias the results that you collect. So it'd be like a man collecting data on women who have experienced sexual assault at the hands of men. Chances are your presence would create some sort of discomfort. And depending on what you're analyzing and how you're collecting it, that might influence how those women could respond to you. In both of these examples, there are very valid concerns. But it is important to note that scientific studies create a controlled environment and mostly only study certain variables. This helps us test hypotheses, but depending on the methods being used, they have some inherent limitations. In other words, science is a tool, and it's important to understand what your tool can do. So, a statistical study can look at the links between two variables and find pretty good evidence that something, let's say bacon, can result in a higher likelihood of a heart attack. But what does this kind of finding mean exactly? Does it mean that eating bacon will eventually lead to a heart attack? What about people who eat bacon every day and live well into their 90s? Could it be the salt in bacon or the fat? Or could it be that people who eat bacon regularly are also more likely to do other unhealthy, self-gratifying things? Or what about sampling? So taking a look at the people that you did survey. Were the people who were surveyed from lower income communities where food options tend to be pretty limited? Now, this would be an example of how economics and politics, in this case, lower socioeconomic status, can be inserted into science studies. And this crisscross between disciplines is appropriate. This exemplifies how scientific studies simulate reality, but are very rarely engaged in everything that's involved in a real-world scenario. By purifying science, we also run the risk of ignoring variables that might also be important. But this doesn't mean that such studies are pointless. It just means that one study can't really stand on its own, and it may result in more questions and answers, and that's okay. Scientific studies build on past research and lay the groundwork for future research. The idea that one study will be the answer to everything is a myth. So the mistake isn't the process or the result. The mistake is that we then start believing that, again, bacon causes heart attacks. Though we know it's more complicated than just simplifying it to bacon in equals heart attacks out. And if current criticisms are any indication, we also know that science studies as an institution is highly political. Science journals are socially constituted systems within themselves that fall prey to regular human problems. And I'm not necessarily talking about science as a methodology and a way of thinking here. Again, science is a tool, and sometimes moderns can use it foolishly. For example, science journals and science funding have deep issues ingrained in them. Sometimes the results that scientists report finding can be a bit problematic because of what many scientists have recently argued against, which is statistical significance. Modern ways of thinking can lead us sometimes to believe too much in our categories. Modernity is more of a frame of mind, a way of thinking than it is actually a way of being. The takeaway is that we have never been modern, but that doesn't mean that modern thinking isn't useful. For example, we operationalize everything, even whether you as an individual prefer to operationalize your own life. We call it being type A or type B. Type A people are planners, and type B people are not, liking to procrastinate or do things without very much planning at all. And there's a wisdom in this realization. And it's that there's more than one way to be efficient or to actually get things done. The problem isn't the categories, but when we believe in them too much. We start limiting ourselves and limiting what the possibilities of what other people can accomplish. We can't feel uncomfortable when things inevitably contradict them, and they will inevitably be contradicted. Humans have been practicing science all over the world since well before we called it science. Corn was created in America by natives thousands of years ago through trial and error. They began cultivating the teosinte plant, and generation after generation, they made it larger with more seeds and through more intensive cultivation. So much that if humans disappeared tomorrow, corn probably would too. Though
life finds a way.
So who knows? But the scientific method is a perfect process because it allows us to take knowledge that we know, to create a hypothesis about a phenomenon based on that knowledge, then test our hypothesis, analyze those results, and see whether we got the answers to our questions, whether we're left with additional questions that need answering, or if additional hypotheses should be formulated and tested. Bruno Latour might argue that pre-modern people made science work on their own terms without ever referring to it as science. But what's certain is that these issues are more complicated than recent debates propose. Being modern isn't the goal, but as Latour proposes, we should be non-modern. This means using the benefits of modernism, pre-modernism, post-modernism, while never fully accepting the modern constitution that wants to separate everything. We can use these tools while being aware of their limitations. Ironically, even though it's called non-modernism, this self-awareness and way of thinking is something that only could have arisen out of modernism. But it's important to figure out what's happening around you or in whatever disciplines you enjoy. It's okay to draw on models and concepts that have already been revealed. They're helpful for understanding the world and for questioning and thinking through important ideas and issues. But the minute you let those models take over and guide your opinion of people and the world around you, that's when, whether we're talking about modernists, anti-modernists, or postmodernists, modernity truly becomes toxic.